Okay, thanks very much for that. Yeah, it's the first time I've had a clap at the beginning of a presentation. So, it seems very fitting that I should be in the Regency Airport talking about relationships because I spent my last night as a single man in this very hotel 24 years ago or something, before I entered into a marital relationship with somebody from just a mile along the road here. So anyway, that's not the kind of relationship I'm going to be talking about this morning. So I'm going to talk about relationships in care settings, and I just need to get my head around this. Yeah, basically my argument, I think, is that we construct our relationships with kids within particular discourses. By discourse, I mean the sort of pattern of assumptions, a framework which really frames what we are allowed to say, and perhaps more importantly, what we're not allowed to say around particular subjects. In this case, what kind of relationships we're allowed to have with kids. And the kind of discourses which have framed the way that we think about kids over the past 20 years or so have been discourses, for instance, of rights and of protection. And I think those are fine up to a point, but they're inadequate, actually. They're insufficient to capture the sort of totality of the kind of relationships that we need to have with kids. And my argument is that we need a new way of thinking about adults and children and the kind of relationships which we have together, and that the idea of upbringing might actually provide that kind of overarching framework within which we can locate those relationships. So the current discourses, as I suggest, rights, protection, attachment, and increasingly I think attachment discourses are considered within an idea of neuroscience. And the big overarching discourse, I think, is one of risk. I'm not going to touch too much on risk, actually, because I need to move quite quickly. But why are some of these discourses inadequate in terms of capturing our relationships with kids? The problem with rights, and I think that children's rights have something to commend them, something that we need to sort of hang on to. They provide a sort of line in the sand about particular expectations about what kids can expect within society. But as an overarching framework for how we actually relate with one another, there are gaps, there are deficiencies there. And as Gunilla Dahlberg and Peter Moss say, that the rights discourse is premised on particular values and a particular understanding of the subject as a rational, autonomous individual. And I think when we take that kind of argument forward into residential care, we become linked to one another only through sort of contractual relationships, no sense of community, interdependence, or difference between generations within the rights discourse. And that idea of difference between generations, I think, is a central one within the idea of upbringing. And we see that in residential care practice. There's an expectation that we have statements of rights. And of course, once we have statements of children's rights, you get staff saying, but what about staff rights? And then you get, what about responsibility? And actually, the responsibilisation discourse is not necessarily helpful either, because we start to actually blame kids for their behaviours and want to do something about them. So responsibility, I think we have to reframe as well, and to reframe it in terms of our responsibility for children, adult responsibility for children, not necessarily kids' responsibilities. So the problem with protection, I think Joan Tronto, in some of her writing on care ethics, suggests that protection involves a very different conception of the relationship between an individual or group and others than does care. Caring involves taking the concerns and needs of the others as a basis for action. Protection presumes bad intentions. And the whole discourse, which I think has framed our way of thinking about kids over the past 20 years, that of child protection, is actually based on a notion of bad intentions, of people who are out to damage kids. And I think that has a number of implications in terms of dismissing sort of wider social context. I think that question and answer session between Michael and Magella earlier suggested actually there's a social context within which these relationships actually are located and occur. And at an intellectual level, at an academic level, the sort of child protection discourse really has very few defenders. That Bob Lawn and others say that child protection policies are increasingly doing more harm than good. They're actually having a corrosive impact upon civil society. Breach Featherston and Sue White talk about the need for and Kate Morris, I think, talk about the need for a humane and compassionate child protection service. The implication being that much child protection practice currently is neither humane nor compassionate. So child protection is a sort of framework within which we locate our relationships with kids is not really adequate. And I would go further and say that it gets in the way of healthy relationships a lot of the time. And most people who have worked in residential childcare will realise that the only game in town recently, over the past few years, has been attachment. And we start to try and bolster attachment-based ideas through recourse to neuroscience. We look at Bruce Perry's work, we look at pictures of brains, and it seems to all click that we've got sort of evidence in front of us that neglect, abuse starts to have an impact upon brains. But actually that whole area is contested, that some of the criticisms of Bruce Perry's work are that he actually is using very extreme cases, that in most cases we do not see that kind of impact on sort of on brain formation. But a wider sort of critique of the whole recourse to neuroscience is from David Cantor there, that the idea that the brain causes behaviour is easier to get across than the subtler and more complex explanation embedded in learning, interpersonal transactions and culture. And I think that's the sort of tension I'm going to try and draw out this morning. That bit about sort of scientific ways of understanding relationships and cultural ways of understanding relationships. And a sort of socio-pedagogical approach would come down, I think, on the side of human interaction and culture. I'm just going to skip over that. So, yeah, my book, Rethinking Residential Childcare, a few years ago, you've got to do something for the publisher and just 150 words or something capturing the essence of the book. And I did this after I'd written the book, and I came up with some trite about we need to move from rights and protection to care and upbringing. And I didn't really know what it meant particularly at that point. And the idea of care is actually present and is visible, very visible in a lot of the literature, especially around some of the feminist ethics of care. And Laura Steckley and I did an article a couple of years ago for Ethics and Social Welfare, applying a sort of care ethics approach to residential childcare. But there's actually very little written about upbringing. It's a term that we use in Scotland. It was used in the Cole-Brandon report. In Ireland, it's used very regularly, I think, in the terms of rearing, in the sense that you rear kids. So what do we mean by it? It's actually not out there in the literature, or at least not in the English-speaking literature. And yet, I would argue that that's what we do. When we interact with kids, we're involved in their upbringing. So it's that idea of upbringing that I want to develop. And I got a sort of lucky break. I'm involved in the Centre for Understanding Social Pedagogy at the Institute of Education in London. And it's a number of academics who get together a couple of times a year from across Europe. And this guy, Paul Stevens, who's Professor of Social Pedagogy at Stavanger, he's an English guy, but he sort of got the gig as Professor of Social Pedagogy without actually knowing what social pedagogy was. But he then set out to discover what it was. But he pointed me in the direction of a website where it was a Canadian and a Norwegian academic, Norm Friesen and Tone Savvy, or however you pronounce those names, were translating the work of the German social pedagogue Klaus Mollenhauer. And Mollenhauer's most famous book is called Forgotten Connections on Culture and Upbringing. And what Mollenhauer does within the book is to explore the idea of upbringing through a reference to a range of different sources, a lot from the literature, from Kafka to St. Augustine, and from wood carvings, basically which depict scenes of upbringing. So he's trying to explore the idea of upbringing through various literary and artistic sources. And just before I go much further, and again, this is that sort of tension that I was talking about earlier, that I think to understand Mollenhauer, we need to understand them as being rooted within a sort of European philosophical tradition. And it's a sort of counterpoint, or a European philosophical tradition might be counterpoised with a sort of Anglo-American one or an American one. And there's a wee quote there which maybe tries to capture that one can't understand the history of education in the United States unless one realises that Thorndike won and Dewey lost. And the sort of distinction there is that Thorndike looked for sort of scientific ways of understanding how we actually engaged with kids and how we brought them up. And you see the evidence of that in the sort of programme fetish that we underwent maybe 15, 20 years ago. We're looking for a programme for everything, a sort of scientific way of interacting with kids. And there's that versus Dewey's idea that we learn through participation in community life. So that's the idea of sort of science versus culture as the dominant or the sort of competing paradigms through which we engage in kids' upbringing. So again, I'm still sort of in the introductory stages here. Some of you will know some of this stuff if you come from a sort of social pedagogical background. Others might not. But the sort of roots of the term pedagogy from the ancient Greek, to raise a child, essentially. And that isn't captured within the sort of German term Erziehung, and Erziehung sort of captures that essence of drawing out or upwards, drawing out that which is innermost. The assumption being that there is something within a child which it is the role of the upbringer to try and sort of hook and draw upwards. And another German term or concept which sort of extends that, the idea of Bildung. Heinz Sunker, who's professor of social pedagogy at Wuppertal, tells us that there's no direct translation for Bildung, but perhaps the best way you can understand it is this idea of lifelong learning, a sort of way of the soul, cultivation of the soul. So the idea of upbringing, I think, is a central one within social pedagogy. Paul Natorp, who's one of the founding fathers of social pedagogy, describes it as the upbringing of an individual and their integration into society. So there you see the sort of the understanding that we're not just dealing with individuals, we're dealing with individuals as members and potential members of society. And what we ought to be concerned about is not just the focus on the individual child, but the focus on how the child might go on to interact within wider society. Mollenhauer makes a similar point, the cultivation of the inner life or soul of the child and their inauguration into culture, this idea of inauguration into culture. And that process, if you like, involves both care and education and wider culture itself. So social pedagogues become upbringers on behalf of society. It's not a term that trips off our tongue necessarily until you start to use it. And then you start to think, well, actually, it makes perfect sense that what residential care workers, what foster carers are doing, the kind of role that they're undertaking is as upbringers on behalf of society. So in his exploration of upbringing, Mollenhauer sets some framing questions. And it's those framing questions that I want to sort of take us through over the next wee while. He asks, well, I'll let you read them and then we'll go through them one by one. So what draws us to want to be involved with children? I'm not sure if, I assumed it would have been a smaller sort of hall, so I'll probably just give you the answers. I was going to ask you to shout out answers. Don't know if anybody wants to. Why do we want to be involved with kids?
Hope.
Hope. Yeah. Yeah.
Love.
Love. Mm-hmm. Hmm? It can be fun, yeah. None of these reasons why we might want to be involved in kids are actually accommodated within much of the policy discourse around kids. If you read that, it's generally about safety. But this idea of hope, optimism, fun, love, it's a different lexicon altogether. But I think it's an important one that Mollenhauer identifies that we become involved in kids through a sort of call and response process. And that might link with some of the ideas of attachment theory. We see a kid, we make contact, we make eye contact. We see a baby, we make eye contact. We see a distressed baby, we come across a distressed baby, we do something to alleviate that distress. So there is a sort of call and response. I think philosophically, some of the Scottish Enlightenment thinking, Thomas Hutchison talks about the idea of benevolence as a sort of sixth sense, that we are actually drawn to the other. More current philosophical thinking, Levinas, says that we are drawn to the face of the other. There is something which makes us, which calls us to respond to the other who confronts us. And in sort of Scottish human relations philosophy and psychology, we're identified as persons in relation, and that we respond, according to John McMurray, not out of an ethic of duty. That would be a very sort of Kantian way of thinking, that our duty to care for our care for the other person is born out of an idea of duty. However, McMurray says that it's not an ethic of duty, but an ethic of love, which drives us to want to actually respond to the other. And that has implications for the way we think about the task of residential childcare, of foster care or whatever, that we've got to conceive of it more as a vocation than a sort of mere job. So what is upbringing? Again, anybody want to give a go at that? We talk about it a lot. Child rearing, when we rear kids, what are we doing? Caring. Mm-hmm. A path. Yeah. Yeah.
Learning.
What's that?
Learning.
Learning. Mm-hmm.
Balance.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Connection, trust.
Okay.
Personality.
Right. Well, let's see what Mollenhauer says. It's about passing on a valued cultural heritage to prepare kids to face the future. This is, again, this idea of culture and passing on a valued cultural heritage. And, again, picking up this idea of responsibility. It's a debt owed by the adult generation to children. We are responsible. We have that kind of responsibility to pass on what we think is valuable. But what is valuable? It's hard to sort of give a normative answer to that. In many respects, our idea of what a good upbringing is can only be based on our own experiences of upbringing. Sometimes we are led to believe that upbringing, there's a sort of Hollywood version of upbringing out there, which is all sort of motherhood and apple pie. But the reality is we can all look at our own upbringing and realise there were bits that were good, there were bits that were less good. The balance for different people will sort of shift in different circumstances. But generally speaking, there's this good and bad element to it. And we can all identify, probably from our own parents and from our own experiences, instances where our parents have been the midwives and the censors of our upbringing. They have allowed us to do particular things, but they've also inhibited us doing from particular things, sometimes for good reason, sometimes for very understandable reasons that perhaps they didn't know how to do otherwise, they didn't have the resources to do otherwise either. So adults act as both the midwives and the censors of children's upbringing. So what do we want for our children? Maybe the same sort of things, hope, love, anything else?
Happiness.
happiness.
Opportunity.
Mm-hmm. What's that? Better than we had, aye. Uh-huh. I think that's absolutely right.
Range of experience.
Uh-huh. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Fulfilling relationships.
What's that?
Fulfilling relationships.
Fulfilling relationships, yeah. Okay, what would...
Cope with life.
Hmm?
Being able to cope with life.
Yeah, yeah. What would Mollenhauer say? That I want perhaps very little goodness in my own life to be perpetuated. That might sound selfish, but actually we do want to pass on something what we consider to be valuable to kids, but we want to take that next step and say we want to do a wee bit better than our own parents did. We want to give them a wee bit better than what we had. And I'd like human history, to continue with a sense of optimism. The more I teach social work students, the more I think that one of the key, not skills, it's not a skill, but one of the key qualities that we ought to be instilling and expecting in social work students is a sense of optimism. Because I don't know how you keep going if you don't have that sense of hope and optimism, and a sense that what we actually do, despite the difficult times, has the potential to make a difference. So that sort of sense of optimism, I think, is at the heart of any sort of child-rearing relationship, the sense or the hope that we can actually make a difference. And that my own existence can be perpetuated in some small way through our children. We want some of what we consider to be good in ourselves to be passed on through generations. And that the way of life I teach children has some value. However, Mollenhauer, and I think this is a fascinating quote. I'll just let you read it there. Can you read it at the back? Is it big enough? Yeah? No? Yeah. I think there's something about bringing up kids which is about taking that step into the unknown and not just trying to replicate what we have. I think that becomes a sort of conservative agenda which is about just raising mini-me's, the sense that we don't want to take too many risks. We want to actually just interact with kids as mirror images of our adult self. Okay, and I think that, again, this is extending the same point, I suppose, but one of my favourite articles actually is from David Webb, and it's in the British Journal of Social Work. It's called A Certain Moment. And in that article, David Webb talks about his maiden aunt, who was the matron of a Church of England children's home. And basically he's making the connection between past and present. And a tendency that we have, I think, to look back at what went on in the past in residential childcare and say it was all bad, it was reactionary stuff. And he's talking about this inversion of the reactionary past and the progressive present, and considering them in terms of contrast between an earlier clarity born of faith and conviction and a contemporary hesitancy towards enforcement of norms and values that are unendingly contested. So we're going into this sort of pluralistic age where we don't really know what our values are a lot of the time, and we're certainly afraid to try and pass them on. And he goes on to use the Italian Marxist and Gramsci and Gramsci's views of education to support his argument, saying that the refusal to teach the child, and I suppose in this context to teach them in a sort of social context, to be involved in their upbringing, amounts to allowing his personality to develop haphazardly by incorporating principles and values chaotically from his or her general environment. And I think that, rightly or wrongly, that's what we see in the sort of public response or discourse around residential childcare just now. Whatever you think of some of the Rotherham report, and I think it's open to fairly substantial critique, but one of the arguments that it's making is that the care system has failed to impart values to kids and has allowed them to basically be, pushed and pulled in response to particular sort of social pressures. And Webb would argue that actually in the past, residential childcare had a sense of purpose, a sense of moral purpose, which would have not allowed that to happen. Now, I'm not sort of coming down on either side, I'm just saying that these are the kind of issues that are around. So, how do children grow and develop? I'll just move on, I think. Again, according to Mollenhauer, it's not the Edward Thorndike approach, it's more the Dewey stuff, not through method or technique, but through relational and personal educational practice. Children grow through relationships. Human development can't be externally forced on the child. Rather, there must be something present in the child which is oriented towards development and which asks for the help. This means that it is in the nature of the child to want to grow. And I think one of the sort of principles in social pedagogy is we've got to find the diamond, if you like, in all children. We've got to find that bit of them that wants to grow and try and latch onto that and try and draw it out, draw it upwards. And again, this idea that children should not be brought up as if they were material to be changed and formed, but brought up in support of a kind of power and potentiality that develops in itself. Not brought up to be mini-me's, but to develop that kind of power and potentiality through a dialogical relationship and that mutual interchange, call and exchange. Okay, we're continually responding to children. If you think about it, Leon Fulcher used to teach about Henry Mayer's work, actually, about the sort of idea of reciprocity, and he'd talk about table tennis balls, ping pong balls just going across the table, and we get into rhythm. And I think that's the kind of dialogical sort of relationship that we start to understand each other, we start to sort of link with one another, we start to be able to use that growing rhythm, interpersonal rhythm, to effect change within one another. So how do we support children's upbringing? Okay, just by being with them. Again, a concept in child and youth care, being with children. And Mollenhauer would say that we can't not engage in upbringing. If you're actually in the proximity of kids at all, then you're going to be involved one way or the other, for good or bad, in their experiences or their experience of upbringing. So it's simply unimaginable for an adult to undertake any education or child-rearing measure without conveying some aspect of him or herself or the way that he or she lives. So this idea that through being with kids, we're passing on something of what we value. And then we're faced with this question about what kind of life we want to present to children. Mollenhauer he differentiates between the idea of presentation and representation or representation, and basically looks at this historically and says that in pre-modern societies, adults and children just go on living their lives in a very sort of narrow sort of confines within the house, within the farm, whatever, within the workshop. So largely undifferentiated ways, and you learnt to become an adult just through watching the adults around you, the German idea of Lebensform. So it's a child's principal educational task to reproduce this image. So upbringing is implicit, habitual, and generally not something that we give too much thought to. You could argue that we still don't give sufficient thought to some of these ideas. So with the growth of merchant capitalism, adult work became separated from children's learning. So we had to then decide what bits of the adult world we wanted to actually pass on and what bits we wanted to shield kids from. So what was considered valuable and what should be filtered out. So we did that through the growth of institutions, schools, youth clubs, children's homes. And those required us to give some forethought to what elements we wanted to pass on, what we wanted to filter out. So we start to think more systematically about how we actually bring children up. It's not just that sort of living in proximity with, which the idea of presentation would have. And invariably, we need to try and get that balance right. Somebody spoke about balance earlier, so we need to get that bit about ensuring age-appropriate shielding from some of the harmful aspects of the adult world, but also to help children reach a position facing the world. And that's not something that you can do through a risk assessment tool or whatever else. It's something that you need to that's cultural essentially. You know kids and you know what particular kids can do. So decisions around, for instance, swimming, you work it out through some sort of cultural ideas about what kids of a similar age or a similar sort of disposition or personality ought to be doing. And you make decisions based on sort of cultural norms rather than sort of scientific or quasi-scientific tools. And some of that can involve a slowing down or a pacing of a child's initiation to the adult world for which adults need to take responsibility. There are some things that we don't want to present kids with, or we don't want to present them with at particular ages, but we might do as they get a wee bit older. You do that in your own sort of relationships with kids, whether your own or whether in care, that you start to introduce them to things gradually. I'm thinking of things like drink, for instance, alcohol, that certainly in my own house, you start to introduce kids to alcohol gradually. Swearing, you don't swear in front of kids until they reach about 16, and then you start to do it gradually. In Ireland, you use feck from an early age, but most of us actually shield kids from that kind of language until they're sort of reaching towards adulthood. But Mollenhauer says that there's a sort of inevitable interplay between this idea of presentation and representation, and that actually it's this sort of implicit stuff that becomes more powerful, that systematic and deliberate representation is linked with unreflective and habitual presentation, and that messages transmitted by conscious teaching are of more limited importance than those that unconsciously seep into a learner's consciousness. So things like gestures, touch, tone of voice, basically things around adult disposition, how adults are with children, start to become very powerful conduits of children's growth and learning. And the pedagogical relationship precedes educational theories and methods. Okay, again, it's the idea that it's the singer rather than the song which becomes important. Some of these programs that we developed can actually be quite effective so long as they're in the right hands, so long as they're actually delivered by somebody who can develop a sort of trusting and valuable relationship with the kids that they're trying to put this program over to. If they don't have that sort of pedagogical and just human relationship, then all the sort of scientific approaches are likely to sort of fall on fallow ground. So, features of a pedagogical relationship. I better move on. No, again, a founding father of social pedagogy talks about the loving relationship of a mature person with a developing person entered into for the sake of the child, so that he, presumably, or she, can discover his or her own life and form. Now, if you started to speak about loving relationships of mature persons with developing persons in this climate, you'd start to see blue lights flashing. And yet, that's what we actually are involved in. When we bring up our own kids, it's a loving relationship across generations. And we've got to offer kids in foster care and residential care something which is on the same sort of level that anybody who's worked in for any length of time in residential care or in foster care knows that the strength of the relationships that build up, that can build up, are actually powerful. They get very close to love. They might be described as love. And yet we're not actually allowed to talk about it in those terms. And yet, when we were talking earlier, somebody said what we want for kids is love. That's one of the qualities that we want to pass on to kids. We need to be able to start to talk about it. So pedagogical relationships are grounded in the difference between generations, and I think that's something that we need to grasp, that we don't always grasp. Within a rights discourse, we tend to miss out that intergenerational bit. We say we all have rights, children have rights, adults have rights, but actually at different points within that relationship, they have different sort of strengths, if you like. There's a sort of John the Baptist moment, I think, where you sort of realise that he or she must increase, I must decrease. You know, that kids reach a certain sort of level, a certain stage in their development where they start to actually overtake you, and you have to take a step or two back in terms of your relationship. Before that point, there's more of a dependency relationship. The adult is actually in more of a sort of dependency, or the kid is in a dependency type role to the adult. But then you get to a certain stage where kids start to make their own decisions and are capable of doing that. And the power balance really shifts. The relationship is oriented to what the child might become, that we're not actually imposing anything on that sort of relationship towards growth. It's asymmetrical. The adult is there for the child in a way that the child is not there for the adult. And I think that's the sort of essence of that sort of professional relationship. It's not relationships just for the sake of it. I think part of the problem with relationships in social work is that we spoke a lot about them in the early years but never actually explored or deconstructed them. And really, they became a wee bit fuzzy. And I think that there's an ethical sort of argument in there that the adult is there for the child in a way that the child is not there for the adult. It's an unequal relationship in that sense, but the balance of that inequality is actually that the adult is actually being responsible. It's dispositional, reflecting the way that adults are with children. Again, things like just touch, gesture, tone of voice, all these things make a difference to the adult-child relationship. And it comes to an end. It may change its complexion. I think that one of the really sort of pernicious aspects of public care over the last 10, 15, 20 years is this injunction that you don't keep contact with kids after they've left. Somehow it was deemed to be unprofessional. And again, what we've got to understand is that the kind of pedagogical relationship does change. It changes in terms of the relative balance of power within that relationship, but it can continue. And actually it ought to continue. If it's an important relationship, then the age of 16 or the fact of leaving care should not actually get in the way of the continuation of that relationship. The sort of power balance within it shifts. And the arena for a pedagogical relationship is the life space. It's through that sort of opportunities for presentation and representation in everyday life. Mollenhauer talks about the aporia of upbringing, aporia being the sort of wicked questions, the circles that we can't square. And we're confronted with this idea of passing on what is deemed valuable while recognising that the fruits of our endeavour cannot be predetermined. I think of the poem by Oscar Romero, that we are prophets of a future not our own. We don't actually know what the fruits of our labour are likely to be or are going to be when we actually engage in bringing up children. And we can't know children. I think we're faced with all sorts of assessment expectations and frameworks and whatever else that lead us to believe that if we can just get the right assessment tool, we can know kids. And yet something invariably comes in from left field to say, actually, we've missed a whole big chunk of kids. And I think philosophically there's a problem with even trying to know kids, that Levinas says that we can only know kids by murdering their alterity and by imposing our own way of thinking and being onto kids. So I think we've got to realise that we don't actually know kids, that the pedagogical relationship, according to Mollenhauer, draws its strength from the tension of opposites and the uniqueness of the individual child. And one of my concerns about this sort of current political interest in social pedagogy or policy interest is that people look simplistically and think, well, we do things better on the continent without looking at it in wider sort of social context. And they think we'll get better outcomes if we just introduce social pedagogy and we'll be able to count those better outcomes. And yet the reality is that you start to compromise the whole essence of social pedagogy when you try and pin it down to measuring outcomes, because its very strength as an approach is that it's not amenable to measurement. It is something which is far more dynamic and organic. So just to draw things to a close, I'm not saying we oughtn't to be concerned with children's rights. As I say, I think they have an important role in terms of setting down lines in the stand. I think that part and parcel of any care relationship, any upbringing relationship, of course we want to protect children. It should not become the dominant or the overarching paradigm within which we sort of interact with them, though. I think ideas of treatment start to impose a power differential, which locates power very much with a sort of expert adult type model. So all of these are things that we need to be aware of. And again, I think it's Mollenhauer, this quote comes from, responses in these areas are necessary but insufficient, because every instance of upbringing has to do with culture as a whole. It can't be subsumed to science or scholarship. Okay, so necessary but insufficient. And the idea of upbringing actually incorporates all of these elements anyway. So upbringing is primarily cultural and social rather than individual, scientific or therapeutic. In sort of epistemological terms, it might be considered to be value rational rather than technical rational. I think we operate in very technical rational times, and we can lose sight of some of the underpinning values which and yeah, I think I've already said that it's dispositional. It requires adults who are reflective, curious, confident, and who feel that they've got something which is worth passing on to the next generation. And again, a social pedagogical term, the ethical, reflexive practice rather than a practice which can be practiced through following procedure. A social pedagogical idea is that if you ask a social pedagogic question, the likely answer you'll get is, it depends. It depends on a particular context and a particular set of circumstances. And yet, we try within sort of policy discourse to pin things down to say, here's a best practice, here's a procedure. If you just follow this, then somehow or other you'll get to the right sort of outcome. And it never actually works, and yet we very rarely question why it doesn't work. It doesn't work because we're operating within the wrong sort of paradigm. We're operating within a technical, rational paradigm rather than a value rational one. And that it's based in the everyday. Claire Cameron talks about social pedagogues as being sort of experts in the everyday. And I think that that's what residential workers are. I've been working on a European project just now looking at the interface between mental health workers and residential care workers. And one of the conclusions I'm drawing from that is that actually all these demands and expectations that they work better together aren't working across the 6 countries that we're actually working across. And one of the reasons that I think they're not working is that they come from different sort of epistemological paradigms. You've got the mental health workers who look for sort of medical or scientific ways of understanding problems, and you've got the care workers who are on this sort of messy, swampy lands of the everyday practice. And yet we valorize the sort of medical and the scientific model over the everyday, and yet the everyday is far more sort of nuanced and complex. And I'll just leave you with that. When I was starting to think about this and write this article, I was cycling through the Highlands with my younger son and his pal, and I was starting to think, well, what aspects of upbringing am I actually engaging with here? Okay. We'll just finish there. Huh? Okay, that's me. Right.